Welcome to Reality Theory episode 4. Let's get the show started right now. Very interesting subject for those of you who play video games and for those of you who are interested in history, conspiracies, and the CIA. This is a really good one. The title for this one is boom, boom, boom. Let's start the show. Call of Duty, CIA, Great PSYOPS. Ooh, sounds scary. All right, so Call of Duty is a very popular video game, first-person shooter. Started off as a World War II video game and has evolved into a video game that you play in the future. You try and kill Castro. You try and kill Iranian generals. So you do a lot of crazy stuff in this video game, but there's a lot of this video game that has me to believe that this video game is a CIA Gray PSYOP. So what is a PSYOP? A PSYOP is a psychological operation used for war of the mind. So we hear the phrase hearts and minds, win over hearts and minds. In order to win a war, you kind of need to win over their civilian population. So that's a psychological operation. Propaganda is a psychological operation because it affects your brain, affects your mind. And it's been going back to World War II. They would dump leaflets over Germany. They would use the radio, they would use loudspeakers, anything to kind of convey information to increase their point of view and maybe scare or intimidate the enemies and gain support from people from their country who need to vote for these wars. All right. So there's been a psychological operations unit in the Army going on forever, and it's kind of definitely advanced from, as I said, dropping leaflets, using loudspeakers. Sometimes they'll use things like loud music to torture people, and that's considered a psychological operation, even though you're not supposed to torture, but other little psychological things they do. So what does the Army say about PSYOPs? Psychological operations are operations to convey selected information and indicators to audiences to influence their emotions, motives, and objective reasoning, and ultimately the behavior of governments, organizations, groups, and individuals. So propaganda is a big PSYOP. You want to control the way people think, and there's lots of different ways you can use propaganda. It's not just in the newspaper or radio and news program, but movies can be propaganda, fiction, TV shows, cartoons. There's many ways that you can affect the way people think. And if you're an organization like the CIA and you want people to subscribe from your worldview, you could subtly put it into a movie with the heroic CIA officer. You could put it into a cartoon with the evil Russian, or you can make a video game where all the bad guys are enemies of the CIA and the CIA are super good guys, and they totally eliminates all the negative history of the CIA, painting a very glossy, heroic portrait of them. Now, there was a really good article in Press News a couple weeks ago about the relationship between Call of Duty and the American military, and let's read a little bit of that. It says, yet a closer inspection of Activision Blizzard's key staff and their connections to state power, as well as details gleaned from documents obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, revealed that Call of Duty is not a neutral first-person shooter, but a carefully constructed piece of military propaganda designed to advance the interests of the U.S. national security state. Press News. Everybody go out and read that article. They cite a colleague of mine, Tom Secker, who's done really good work in showing the relationship between the U.S. military and Hollywood, and groups like Marvel, and very close ties. So definitely go out there and read that. So who are these people at the Activision Blizzard staff who might have worked for the CIA? One of these people is Brian Bulatao, and he is the Chief Administration Officer for Call of Duty's parent company, Activision Blizzard, and was the formerly Chief Operating Officer and second in command at the CIA, alongside longtime friend and business partner Mike Pompeo, who was the head of the CIA under Trump and went on to be the Secretary of State under Trump. And Bulatao would later become Pompeo's second in command to the State Department. So this is a very powerful person in government moving on to working at a video game company, has no experience at video game companies or entertainment, has some business experience. And it seems like he just kind of joined the CIA under Mike Pompeo, but you don't just join the CIA and become like second in command. You usually have a long-standing relationship with them. So Brian Bulatao, the big dog over at Call of Duty's parents company, is also a high-ranking CIA officer. So one PSYOP that got revealed was called Operation Devil Eyes. Now, this is a crazy as it sounds, use toys as propaganda, whatever. The CIA teamed up with G.I. Joe creator Don Levine to create an Osama bin Laden doll. And what they did with this Osama bin Laden doll is they made it so in the sun, the face would kind of melt and burn away and it would be a demon. So the psychological effect of this is all the kids in Afghanistan playing with their bin Laden dolls would realize that bin Laden was a demon and they would turn against bin Laden. So this is a psychological operation. It was revealed after Don Levine died, and he told all this stuff to his family. So they contacted the CIA, and so the CIA kind of had to let it out about this kind of psychological operation using toys. And Osama bin Laden, very interesting. G.I. Joe, Osama bin Laden toys. Now, you would think maybe was G.I. Joe a psychological operation or propaganda to make American kids want to be heroes if the opposite is they're using with Osama bin Laden toys, but I guess we'll never know. Don Levine didn't mention it. So movies are a really big form of propaganda. People think they're watching fiction. You think you're getting some escapism from the real world when actually you're being influenced by real world events unknowingly. So Rambo 3 was an 80s movie, and in Rambo 3, Rambo goes and joins these kind of these rebels in Afghanistan, and at the end we see that this film is dedicated to the brave Mujahideen fighters of Afghanistan. And they changed this title after all the terrorism that the Mujahideen did and a lot of the narcotics traveling did. But this we can see as an example of how movies are trying to use to shape people's worldviews on politics. So you watch this movie, next thing you know, oh, the Mujahideen are good. Now people are voting in Congress to fund the Mujahideen. Oh, that's great. Let's do it. So that's how you kind of get political sport through movies as propaganda. Video games have been used as propaganda for quite some time now. Now, there's a video game called Contra that came out, I think, around 86, 87. At the same time, you have these Iran-Contra hearings where people like the Oliver North, who we'll get into later, was testifying and lying to Congress about illegal arms deals to Iran. Now, at the same time, you had this video game, Contra, which was based on action movies like Rambo, which you saw before, and Predator, which you had a CIA agent going into some Latin American country and fighting aliens. And now people are kind of thinking when they associate Contra, right, you associate it with the video game. So the Contras, they weren't evil drug-dealing savages who killed civilians. No, the Contras are good people who fight against aliens. So that's a kind of psychological effect that video games as propaganda can have. So let's get started with Call of Duty. So ISIS apparently uses Call of Duty to radicalize young men. All right, they even have propaganda videos where they use like Call of Duty style effects and first-person shooter effects to recruit Muslims to join ISIS, and they even use Call of Duty memes. This is our Call of Duty, and we respawn in Jannah. So if ISIS could use Call of Duty as propaganda, could the CIA or the American government use Call of Duty as propaganda? Let's look into it. Now, the biggest form of CIA propaganda in the whole Call of Duty Series 3 is Black Ops 1 and Black Ops 2, which I think were released around 2009, 2012. Now, Black Ops 1 is you're this guy, Alex Mason, and you're in this Operation 40 assassination unit. And Operation 40 for years was denied by the CIA. Like they didn't talk about it, and anything files were heavily redacted. So only people who really do real research on like the JFK assassination and the CIA know about Operation 40. So it's kind of surprising to have them in this video game. But Operation 40 was an assassination group, and they were out to kill Castro and other high-level Cuban politicians. And they were part of the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, where a bunch of CIA and anti-Castro Cubans tried to invade Cuba, and Fidel Castro kind of kicked them out, and they lost. It was a big moment of shame for the CIA, this kind of big failed invasion. But the protagonist is part of this failed invasion, and he actually kills Fidel Castro in this game. So, for those people who've done research, that the CIA has been trying to kill Castro for years and years and years. I think there's even documentary called like 638 Ways to Kill Castro, based on all the CIA plots to kill Castro. So here we see Castro using a J-Lo lookalike as a body shield, while the protagonist, Alex Mason, is trying to kill him. Now, Alex Mason does kill Fidel Castro, but surprise, it's not Fidel Castro, it's a body double. And then Alex Mason gets kidnapped by a Russian general, and the Russian general brainwashes Alex Mason with something they say is similar to MK Ultra, which is an infamous CIA kind of brainwashing program. So after Alex Mason is brainwashed, he winds up in Dallas, Texas, on November 22nd in 1963. And for those who studied the JFK assassination, you probably know what that date is and what it means.
14, 2, 3, 19, 0, 8, 11, 22, 21, 5, 17, 17, 0, 10, 2, 23, 1, 8, 11, 25, 22, 9, 4,
6.5 millimeter,
9, 23, 1, 12, 0, 12, 16,
11, 22.
6, 12, 8, 4, 1, 6, 2, 10, 2, 1.
Texas. Ascension.
So that's Alex Mason right there, preparing to kill Kennedy. And for those who studied the JFK assassination like myself, and I'm definitely everyone, please go back and watch episode 1 of Reality Theory, in which I covered the JFK assassination. You'll know that Operation 40 was part of also a conspiracy to kill JFK, because after the Bay of Pigs failed invasion, JFK would not bring in air support, so they hated JFK for that. So the members of Operation 40 turned around and killed JFK. Now in Call of Duty, we have an Operation 40 member, Alex Mason, killing JFK, but the conspiracy is from the Russians, because the Russians brainwashed him into killing JFK. So let's look at Operation 40. Who is in this infamous Operation 40 that Call of Duty is kind of glorifying in their video game? All right, so here's Marie Lorenz. Marie Lorenz, go back, definitely. We do a lot on Marie Lorenz on my first episode of Reality Theory, so go back, watch episode 1. So Marie Lorenz says, Miss Lorenz described Operation 40 as an assassination squad consisting of about 30 anti-Castro Cubans and their American advisors. She claimed the group conspired to kill Cuban Premier Fidel Castro and President Kennedy, whom it blamed for the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Okay. Admitted taking part. Sturgis admitted taking part 2 years ago that he took part in Operation 40. There are reports that Operation 40 had an assassination squad, he said. I'm not saying that personally, but they would kill if they had to. Except for Oswald, who was accused of murdering Kennedy, none of the men named by Miss Lorenz has been linked to the president's death. Miss Lorenz said she first met Oswald, whom she knew only as Ozzy, when he called at an Operation 40 safe house in Miami's Little Havana section in the summer or early fall of 1963. She said she asked Sturgis, who's the stranger, and he replied, he's okay, he's one of us. She said Oswald later visited an Operation 40 training camp in the Florida Everglades. The next time she saw him, Miss Lorenz said, was at a midnight meeting in the Miami home of Orlando Bosch. All right, so let's look a little deeper. Who was in Operation 40? There's not much out there, so the information that's out there is from a website called Spartacus, which sources from several books on the JFK assassination and on the CIA. So one person in Operation 40 is E. Howard Hunt. Now, E. Howard Hunt was the former assistant to CIA head Allen Dulles. He was the planner of the Bay of Pigs invasion and the mastermind of the Watergate burglary. He was actually sentenced to maybe like 4 or 5 years in jail for the Watergate burglary. Later, he admitted in a confession to his son to being involved in the JFK assassination and implicated several others, including President Lyndon Johnson. All right, so who is Frank Sturgis, who Marita Lorenz mentioned in that article? Frank Sturgis was a former ally of Castro, so he was selling weapons to Castro originally. Then he began working with the CIA before the Bay of Pigs invasion, when the kind of CIA turned against Castro. They didn't like him anymore. He was also convicted alongside E. Howard Hunt in the Watergate burglary, so they've definitely been working together for a long time. And he is a known mafia associate of Santo Trafficante and Meyer Lansky, who are two infamous mafia figures who are also, interestingly enough, tied to the CIA. And also Frank Sturgis was implicated by Marita Lorenz and E. Howard Hunt in the JFK assassination. So who else is in Operation 40? Orlando Bosch, who Marita Lorenz mentioned. He was convicted for terrorism in 1968 for trying to launch a bazooka at a Cuban ship. Bosch would also be convicted of killing 83 people in an airline terrorist bombing of a Cuban plane and numerous other terrorist activities. Now, Orlando Bosch is known as Dr. Death. He helped form an organization called CORU, which is CORU, C-O-R-U, which is a bunch of anti-Castro Cuban terrorists and drug dealers who had connections to the CIA, and they went on a crazy terrorism spree from like around 1976 to 1980. And his friend right here we have is Luis Posada, who is known as the Bin Laden of the Americas. Now, he is a former CIA agent, longtime CIA agent from the Bay of Pigs. He was convicted, along with Bosch, of blowing up a Cuban plane and killing 83 civilians in one of the first acts of airline terrorism. And also, if you've seen the movie Scarface, when they are trying to blow up the car of the diplomat who's speaking against the drug dealers, that's actually based on a real scene in which these two guys plotted to kill Orlando Letelier, who was a Chilean diplomat who was speaking out against Augusto Pinochet and Chile, who were selling cocaine there. So they actually blew up his car. So Scarface was too nice of a guy to blow up the car with the diplomat. But these guys, they really blew up this guy's car on Embassy Road, killing him and his assistant. It's a crazy story. There's a great book on it, Murder on Embassy Road. Yeah, so these guys are also Operation 40. So who else is Operation 40? Barry Seal, for movie buffs or people who like Tom Cruise movies. You watch American Made, about kind of infamous drug smuggler Barry Seal. If you watch Narcos, Barry Seal is on Narcos. So Barry Seal worked with both the CIA and Air America. So Air America was a program in Vietnam in which opium from Laos and other places in Southeast Asia would be shipped to America to sell. And now this money that came back from the opium would be used to fund these kind of illegal wars in Laos. So Barry Seal was a pilot back then, moving drugs, and then he became a pilot during Iran-Contra for Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel. After he was killed, it was said that he found the people found like a book of his with George Bush's number, and I think he allegedly told people that he had photographic images of the Bush brothers, Jeb and George, handling cocaine in Miami, and that he was using that to blackmail George Bush, and he got killed before he could do that. Felix Rodriguez is another infamous Operation 40 member. Again, he's another anti-Castro Cuban, part of this Brigade 2506, which was a lot of anti-Castro Cubans who tried to invade Cuba for the Bay of Pigs. Longtime CIA agent. He was actually involved in the killing of Che Guevara and Operation Phoenix, which also was going on in Vietnam at the same time as Air America, which was a program that killed civilians, targeted civilians, and did a lot of horrible things, torture, executions. So according to several sources, Rodriguez was heavily involved in the drug trade during Iran-Contra. So there was another accountant for the kind of Cuban cocaine mafia by the name of Ramon Milian Rodriguez, and he testified to Congress that Felix Rodriguez was tied up with Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel, and was using money from Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel to fund the Contras. There's a really good documentary on Amazon Prime called The Last Narc, and it's about the death of Kiki Camarena. People who watch Narcos might know the death of Kiki Camarena, Narcos Mexico, the DEA agent who got killed. And actually, which isn't in Narcos, but is evident in the documentary The Last Narc, Felix Rodriguez was working with the Mexican cartel to capture Kiki Camarena, and Felix Rodriguez was torturing and interrogating Kiki Camarena to find out what he knew about this kind of CIA drug ring going on in Mexico during Iran-Contra. Also, we've had 2 CIA heads as Operation 40 members. We've had Porter Goss. Now, after leaving the CIA in 1971, Goss would eventually become a congressman in Florida before serving as CIA director under George W. Bush in 2004 at the time of the Iraq War. So and also another member of Operation 40, according to several sources, was George H.W. Bush, the director of the CIA in 1976, vice president from 1981 to 1989, president from 89 to 93, and he was also undercover CIA during the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was also called Operation Zapata, which was the name of George Bush's company, Zapata Oil. All right, so Alex Mason, after he kills John F. Kennedy, he rejoins the CIA, and they send him to Vietnam for Operation Phoenix, which I talked about a little bit earlier, which was a really horrible assassination program that targeted civilians in Vietnam who might have supported the Viet Cong, not soldiers, but kind of really targeted civilian infrastructure. And there was a lot of assassinations, a lot of torture. And I think numbers from 20,000 to 50,000 civilians were killed. And there were a lot of civilians killed in Vietnam by like bombs, right? Now they would call this collateral damage. Oh, we meant to bomb the Viet Cong, but we bombed a village instead, right? So that's one way civilians were killed. But also in Operation Phoenix, it was straight targeted assassinations, targeted executions, a lot of horrible crimes. There's a book on it by Doug Valentine, Operation Phoenix. I highly recommend you read it, look it up, Google it, Operation Phoenix. Another thing that was going on that I talked about in Vietnam, at the same time, this fictional character, Alex Mason, comes. So first he goes to Vietnam, then he goes to Laos. And what was going on in Laos was massive opium being smuggled from Vietnam and Laos back into America. And this caused a major heroin epidemic. A lot of Vietnam soldiers got addicted. And there was a CIA airline called Air America. And this was where a lot of the opium was being transferred from Southeast Asia to the United States and Europe from. But there's no mention of either of these things in Call of Duty. In Call of Duty, I guess the main plot, right? So the main plot for Black Ops 1 is that there's this evil Russian general, and he recruits a Nazi soldier to make all these evil scientific weapons, right? So this actually was based on an American phenomenon called Operation Paperclip, in which after World War II, the predecessors to the CIA would bring in these horrible, like Nazi scientists, Nazi Gestapo officers, so people like Klaus Barbie, people like Joseph Mengele, and these guys were like horrible interrogators and scientists, and they were brought to America to work with the CIA on all sorts of experiments. So this was Operation Paperclip, but in the Call of Duty video game, it's the Russians who were recruiting the Nazi scientists for these evil experiments. Now, one of these evil experiments was some nerve gas that they were using, that the Russians were using in Vietnam. In reality, it was the Americans who were using this horrible nerve gas, Agent Orange, which caused so many deformities. It's a real example of chemical warfare. So when you hear people talk about chemical weapons and how dangerous they are, a great example is Agent Orange, which killed thousands, deformed many. It's been like, Google Agent Orange. I don't want to go into it. It's really sickening. So here, after Alex Mason saves the world from the evil Russians, he retires for a bit, and who comes to get him out of retirement but the real American hero, Oliver North, who lied to Congress for patriotism, who sell drugs for patriotism. So who was Oliver North really? Interestingly enough, Oliver North was the military consultant, and he actually played himself in Call of Duty Black Ops 2. According to numerous sources, he ran a major drug and money laundering scheme to arm the Contras, and the sources include people like Terry Reid, who wrote a book, Compromise, a really good book about what was going on in Arkansas, which uses a kind of transshipment point for cocaine during Iran-Contra. Chip Tatum, who actually has all his documents about all the conversations that Oliver North had about organizing the drug trade. And another person is Al Martin. Now, Al Martin said that Oliver North was such a big player in the drug trade in the 80s that he was actually setting the price for a kilo that would go nationally. So that's Oliver North, but he's a hero in Call of Duty, and he's also a consultant. So he's helping frame their narrative. You have a liar and a criminal is helping frame the narrative of the history of the CIA in Black Ops 2. So after Oliver North gets you out of retirement, you go to Angola, right? You go all the way to Southern Africa to Angola, and you fight with this man, Joseph Savimbi, who is your heroic ally and the CIA's war against the MPLA, right? The MPLA were being supported by Fidel Castro, and Joseph Savimbi was not only being supported by America and the CIA, he was also being supported by racist South Africa. This is apartheid South Africa. And he was actually considered like their tool, their blackface tool in Angola to kind of increase their apartheid policies in Angola. So Joseph Savimbi was getting a lot of money from P.W. Botha in the apartheid era. So here we have collaboration between apartheid South Africa and the CIA to fight an elected government, the MPLA in Angola. So this, you don't see this again in Call of Duty. They don't talk about apartheid or Joseph Savimbi being widely known as a kind of puppet for the apartheid government in South Africa. But in Call of Duty, he's a hero fighting alongside Alex Mason. So after he comes back from Angola, he goes and meets Manuel Noriega. Manuel Noriega is initially his friend, and they go after a Nicaraguan drug dealer called Raul Menendez, which is really interesting given the time period, because most of the drug dealing was not coming from Nicaragua during the 1980s. It was coming from Colombia, Costa Rica, Honduras, El Salvador, countries that were allies to the United States, not countries that were enemies of the United States. So he actually comes back after Noriega helps him kind of get this guy, Raul Menendez. Noriega actually turns against Alex Mason, and this leads to Operation Just Cause. Now, Operation Just Cause is when George Bush invaded the country of Panama to kind of get Manuel Noriega, who was being indicted on drug charges. Now, these two have had a close relationship for years, from 1976 when George Bush was the director of the CIA and Manuel Noriega was an asset of the CIA. Oliver North was meeting very regularly with Manuel Noriega and was telling everybody he had a great relationship with him. So after he kind of went a little rogue, they had a really horrible invasion of Panama again, where you had civilians being killed and all sorts of other stuff. But you don't see this in the video game. You don't get to learn about the very close relationship between Manuel Noriega and the CIA and the drug trade in the video game. You just get to see Manuel Noriega as this kind of cartoon character who turns on the United States and becomes a villain after he was their friend, without really showing the real relationship between them. So after he leaves Panama, he goes to Afghanistan and he fights alongside the Mujahideen like Rambo. So once again, we have these American war heroes fighting alongside the Mujahideen. Now, I guess in retrospect, Call of Duty has had hindsight to kind of go back at this. So they make the Mujahideen bad guys who initially they fight with the CIA guys. Initially, they're fighting against the Russians, the CIA guys. Then Raul Menendez turns these Mujahideen against the CIA. So there was, as with Manuel Noriega, they kind of craft this relationship between the CIA and these people, but then say, oh no, they're really bad guys, and which kind of sanitizes the CIA's real relationship with the Mujahideen and Manuel Noriega. So what they left out about Operation Cyclone in Afghanistan was two big things. Was once again, the narcotics. A lot of these mujahideen that were fighting alongside the CIA in Afghanistan got heavily into the narco trade. And we see it again when America invaded Afghanistan in 2001, the explosion of opium and heroin out of Afghanistan. But this, started way back when the USA and CIA were funding the Mujahideen to get the Russians in the 80s. And another thing they kind of leave out is the real level extremism. And a lot of these CIA supported Mujahideen went on to be very powerful figures in Al-Qaeda, very powerful figures in ISIS, very powerful figures in the Taliban. And if you look at the whole Afghanistan war, right? So they invaded to kick the Taliban out. That's what they told us. Spent billions and billions of dollars, killed hundreds of thousands of people, and then they just give it back to the Taliban. So we're going to close this right now. And just in general, it's pretty blatant to me that Call of Duty is CIA propaganda. And I really want everyone to go back and watch Reality Theory episode 1 to see the real theory. And you can watch the Call of Duty video game like the cutscene, so you could see the whole story on YouTube. So they have Black Ops 1, you can watch the whole story where he kills Kennedy. Yeah, the CIA killed Kennedy, they're finally telling the truth. But no, he was brainwashed by a Russian, and it was the Russians. Oh man, I thought a video game would tell the truth, but no, it didn't. And you got Black Ops 1, Black Ops 2, you could watch them on YouTube, and then also watch Reality Theory episode 1. And there's also some really good documentaries on Iran Contra, which I'm going to put in the description, which you can contrast with Black Ops 2. So thanks y'all so much. Be ready for the next episode of Reality Theory. It's going to be amazing as well. I'm really excited, and peace out to y'all.